Hey everyone, it's good to be with you tonight. Thanks for joining me in our study tonight of God's Word. I hope that the things that we'll talk about tonight will be helpful for you, be some things that you can take with you this week and make part of your life. Sermon ideas come from all sorts of places, right? And so my sermon idea tonight came from a book that I've been reading on kindness, and just as a challenge to be kind for 30 days. So it's kind of this kindness challenge thing. But, anyways, there was a phrase that I read in the specific chapter that I was reading that caught my attention. And it said this: what you focus on is what you see. And that's a pretty thought-provoking phrase, isn't it? What you focus on is what you see. And the author went on to say this, that what you allow yourself to focus on will impact what you actually observe around you. You will notice more and more of what you focus on, or conversely, less and less of what you don't want to see. And so she was using that in the context of relationships that or marriages, that sometimes it is easy to focus on the things that our spouses do that are wrong, and when we focus on that we miss seeing the whole picture of that person and maybe some of the things that we've overlooked that they're actually doing well, or something of that effect. But I thought about that phrase, that what we focus on is what we see. And I think there's some spiritual application there that I want to spend some time thinking about tonight. And so it comes back to our vision. It comes back to restoring our focus, to focus on the right kinds of things. And as I was thinking about this more, and that phrase, what you focus on is what you see, it made me think about a passage in 1 Samuel chapter 17. If you'll be turning there, 1 Samuel chapter 17. And that is the story of David and Goliath, a story that you probably know very well. And so I just kind of want to summarize the story since we're pretty familiar with it. And at the end of the story, we'll come back and talk about this point, about what we focus on is what we see. But let me summarize what's going on in 1 Samuel chapter 17 for just a moment. Again, we're familiar with this story. You probably heard this story growing up in children's Bible classes and things of that nature. But remember that the Philistines have gathered their army to fight against Israel. And basically, the Philistines are on one side of the mountain or the hill, and the Israelites are on the other side, and there is the valley of Elah in between them. It's a place that you can go today and kind of see all of that. And a champion, a warrior, comes out from the Philistine army named Goliath, who was from Gath. And the champion basically means it was the Philistines' best fighter. Sometimes, rather than using all the men to fight the battle, what armies would do in the ancient culture is send out their best fighters to fight against one another, and whoever won, whoever lost would surrender to the side that won. And that's exactly what's going on in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Look at verse 4. 1 Samuel 17 verse 4. It says, "Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, 'Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and I kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us." Again, the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And so, to that point, the Philistines send out one of their champion fighters, Goliath, who is just intimidating, right? He comes out probably 9.5 feet tall, clothed with this massive, heavy armor. I don't know what he would have looked like, but it is just scary to even think about it, right? Of how massive this guy is. And he makes this proposition: send out one of your best fighters. We will fight man on man, mano y mano. Whoever wins, the other side will surrender to. You know, if you win, then fine, we will surrender to you. If we win, you will surrender to us. And Goliath comes out on a daily basis to taunt the army of Israel. It is psychological warfare. And this is purely to humiliate and produce fear in the Israelites, and it works, right? You saw verse 11, you read verse 11. When Saul and Israel heard these words, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. They were in constant fear. No one wants to do this. Everybody's afraid. You ever thought, though, what is it that makes Goliath so terrifying, right? Why is he so fearful? Is it not his height, his imposing stature, right? Like, you have to look up to him, which is kind of the story of my life. But you look up to him. He is an imposing figure. No one wants to go near him. And it sends chills down Israel's back. But doesn't Israel have a Goliath? Doesn't Israel have a champion among them? Isn't there someone among Israel that they chose as king for this very purpose? Doesn't Israel have someone who is taller than everybody else from the shoulders up? It's Saul, right? Saul is their champion fighter. Saul was chosen to be a king. Do you remember why he was chosen to be king? 1 Samuel chapter 8. Not only, yes, because they wanted a king like the other nations, but what else was it? They wanted a king who would fight their battles. This is the moment for Saul to rise up and show himself to be the king Israel wanted, but he's not anywhere. He's afraid just like everybody else. And so I want you to kind of see that picture, that Saul was chosen to be that person, and he's not showing himself to be the king Israel wanted. But it's in the midst of Saul's fear and Israel's fear that David comes along, and we find David's courage. He comes to the battle line. He's coming to check on his brothers and so forth, and he hears Goliath's taunts, and he begins to ask these questions. Why are you guys allowing this guy to do that to you? Why are you allowing him to taunt you? Why isn't anyone doing anything about this guy? Why are you allowing this to go on? And so David eventually says, well, if nobody else is going to go and fight him, I will go fight him. But nobody thinks that David can do it. In fact, his own brother, verse 28 of the chapter, 1 Samuel 17, verse 28. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger burned against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? So maybe Eliab's a little bit jealous that David is doing this, or he's frustrated with David. Why have you even come down here, David? He goes on to say, I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you've come down in order to see the battle. And so everybody's doubting David. He's just this young guy. He doesn't stand a chance. The odds are not in his favor. But David insists. He keeps on insisting that I'm able to fight Goliath. I can do this because God is with me. And so David is brought to Saul, and I want you to kind of imagine what this scene would have been like for a moment. Someone comes to Saul and says, hey, we've got a volunteer who's going to fight Goliath. If Saul is not wanting to do this, he's terrified. He's willing to pay someone to fight Goliath. Look at verse 25 of this chapter. It says, the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who is coming up? Speaking of Goliath, truly it will be that the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. And so David is willing to stand in the gap and do that. And I want you to just kind of imagine the scene as David comes in to Saul, wherever he's at, and someone says, hey, this is our volunteer. And Saul is thinking, you've got to be kidding me, right? This kid is going to be pummeled. There's no way he stands a chance against Goliath. And so Saul tries talking David out of that. Look at verse 33. It says, actually, verse 32, David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Then Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. So, David, you are out of your mind. You're crazy. Saul has been fighting people from his youth, and you're just a young person. He eats people like you for breakfast. Verse 34, but David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock. I went out after him and attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. When he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So David is saying, listen, God has been with me. He has delivered me out of every trouble and difficulty that I find myself in. And this will be the same situation here. God, who has given everything else into my hand, will do the same with this uncircumcised Philistine, because he's taunted the army of the living God, and this cannot go on. And when Saul realizes he cannot stop David, he clothes him with his armor. It's not working for David. He's never tested it out. He can't really walk with it. And so David throws off the armor. He takes his sling and 5 smooth stones from the brook, and he goes on and he fights Goliath. And you know the rest of the story, that the crucial statement in verse 45. After the Philistine taunts David, he says, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you, and I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord is not delivered by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. David has confidence that the battle belongs to the Lord, and David is victorious. He hits Goliath with a stone and cuts off his head, and the victory is Israel's. It's a powerful story. But I want you to come back with me to the point that we're trying to emphasize here. What you focus on is what you see. And I want you to think about this for a moment. I want you to go back and think about the story of 1 Samuel 17. Let's make 2 different categories, right? You've got Saul and Israel and David. They both saw the same thing, didn't they? They saw Goliath. But the turning point was what they chose to focus on, wasn't it? Saul in Israel saw Goliath, but what they focused on was his size and cowered in fear. So Saul in Israel focused on the size of Goliath and cowered in fear. David saw Goliath as well, but he focused on the size of God and rose up in courage. So both of them saw the same thing, but what they focused on was what made all the difference. David saw Goliath and he realized that Goliath stands no chance between the great and mighty God that he served. That despite how big his enemies might be, the battle belongs to the Lord. There's no one greater or mightier or more stronger than the God that I serve. And so, my question for you tonight is, what are you focused on? Paul tells us in Ephesians chapter 6 that we are engaged not in physical warfare, but spiritual warfare. We are in a battle against an adversary that we cannot see physically, but we are in a spiritual battle. We are waging war for our souls. And although we cannot physically see him, we know that he is there. Ephesians 6 and verse 12, starting verse 10, read along with me. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the full armor of God so that you will be able to resist in the evil day, and having done everything to stand firm, therefore, having girded your loins with truth, having put on the breastplate of righteousness, having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. In addition to all, taking up the shield of faith with which you will be able to extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. So we have an enemy, and God has given us his armor that we would put it on, that we might be able to defend ourselves against the schemes of the devil. And I want you to think about this warfare that we're engaged in. Who am I most like? Am I more like Saul in Israel? And I focus on the size of the adversary? Do I focus on setbacks and failures or mistakes that I've made in the past? And if so, I'm never going to move forward because that's all that I'm focused on. All of my failures, all of the enemy. I'll never move forward because I can't see past that. Or am I like David? And do I realize that God is greater than my adversary? God has won victory already. Jesus died, shed his blood, and rose again on the third day, victorious over sin and death. The battle is won. It belongs to the Lord. And what I need to do is keep fighting, keep waging war, keep remaining faithful. So what am I focused on? I can focus on the uncertainties of life, the fears, the instability of our culture right now. But if so, my vision is going to be distorted and blurred. But if I can look through these troubling times, if I can look through the adversary that I'm against with God's lens, the right lens, then I can see clearly that he remains upon his throne in complete control. And I need to focus on that. The psalmist in Psalm 121 would say something to us about that. Go over to Psalm 121. Psalm 121. starting in verse 1, the psalmist says this: I will lift up my eyes to the mountains. From where shall my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not allow your foot to slip. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun will not smite you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will protect you from all evil. He will keep your soul. The Lord will guard your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forever. And so I want you to think about what he's saying in the very beginning verses, that we would lift up our eyes and focus on the thing that we ought to be focusing on. That we would lift up our eyes and see our helper who sits upon his throne, ready to help us through the times in which we live. I need to focus on him, because what I focus on is what I see. Let me leave you one last passage as we wrap up our time together tonight. And I hope this has been helpful to you to make kind of that differentiation, that we may all see similar things, but what we focus on is really what matters most. Hebrews chapter 12, familiar passage, I'm sure. Hebrews 12. This is the incredible summation of all the heroes of faith that the Hebrew writer has been talking about, who chose to focus on God, who chose to live by faith rather than looking at their present circumstances. And Jesus is the culmination of all of that. He is the most perfect hero of faith, I guess you could say. And so he says in verse 1, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Jesus, despite everything that was going on around him, chose to focus on where he was going. He focused on the Father. And so he could run his race with endurance. He could finish the race by giving his life. He endured the cross and finished what he came to do because he was focused on the right thing. And so we then are challenged to fix our eyes on him as we run our race. That word, fix our eyes, can literally mean to determine to do something, to look up to, and could mean to have in full view. It's just the idea of focusing on Jesus, looking at how he endured and ran his race despite everything going on around him, and that we would see past the trials, we would see past the things that may entangle us and fix our eyes on him, fix our eyes on the finish line. And so that's our challenge this week, to focus on Jesus. Because what I focus on is what I see. And so I hope that you'll take that with you this week. With all of the things going on in our culture, it's easy to have our vision blurred or distorted. But I would encourage us to restore our focus this week, to think about the things that God would have us to think about. We're not dismissing how difficult life can be, but what we're choosing to do with this is to see them through the right lens and to focus on what matters most. So I hope that'll help you. Thanks for joining again with me tonight, and we'll see you next time. Take care.